For more than 60 years, Star Trek has built its universe on one simple assumption. Mars was humanity's neighbor, humanity's colony, and eventually humanity's shipyard, but it was never home to an intelligent civilization. That idea remained untouched across countless television series, movies, novels, and games. Then, in a single episode, Strange New Worlds completely rewrote that history. At first glance, it looks like one of the biggest retcons Star Trek has ever attempted. But the more you examine what the episode is actually doing, the more fascinating the mystery becomes. Because the real twist isn't that intelligent Martians once existed. The real twist is that Starfleet appears determined to make sure no one ever learns they existed at all. Before we dive in, if you enjoyed deep Star Trek theories that go beyond simple recaps, consider subscribing. Every script on this channel is researched and written by me from the available material, not copied from someone else's breakdown. If you enjoy exploring hidden ideas like this one, sharing the video helps it reach more fans who love discussing Star Trek's biggest mysteries. The article points out something incredibly important. Rather than introducing Martians into the modern Star Trek timeline, the writers placed them 65 million years in the past. That single creative decision changes everything. Instead of creating endless continuity problems with every previous series, the story takes place so far back in history that almost no future character could ever naturally encounter evidence of that civilization. According to the article, the Enterprise becomes trapped in an extraordinary causality paradox where history unfolds in such a way that the Martians, the Doldrum, and Starfleet itself become intertwined in the chain of events that eventually allows humanity to evolve. That's already an enormous revelation, but notice where the article spends most of its attention. It isn't celebrating the Martians themselves. It keeps returning to one specific detail. Starfleet buries the Discovery. That raises a question much bigger than ancient Mars. Why would Starfleet hide one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in galactic history? The obvious answer would be to preserve the timeline. The article suggests that the revelation is quietly buried in much the same way as the disappearance of the USS Discovery. Within the review's framing, that explains why later Star Trek stories never mention intelligent Martians. On the surface, that explanation works beautifully. It protects continuity while allowing the franchise to introduce a completely new piece of ancient history. But what if preserving history isn't the whole story? Think about what this discovery actually means. Humanity spends centuries believing Mars never hosted an intelligent civilization. Scientists, explorers, historians, and archaeologists all build their understanding of the solar system around that assumption. Then, one classified mission completely overturns it. Suddenly, Starfleet isn't simply protecting the timeline. It's deciding which version of history future generations are allowed to know. That idea feels surprisingly consistent with the pattern the article highlights. The review compares this cover-up directly to the classified fate of the USS Discovery. Whether those situations are identical isn't the point. The comparison suggests a recurring theme inside Starfleet itself. Whenever a discovery becomes too dangerous, too disruptive, or too difficult to explain, the institution chooses silence over disclosure. If that's true, then the Martian civilization isn't the greatest secret in the episode. The cover-up is. Another fascinating point raised by the article is the causality paradox itself. Humanity survives because events unfold exactly as they do. The Martians and the Doldrum become part of a chain that eventually leads to humanity's existence. That means the Enterprise cannot simply stop the tragedy without threatening everything that follows. This creates one of Star Trek's oldest philosophical questions in a completely new form. How much suffering is acceptable if changing it destroys the future? The review argues that the Enterprise is forced to allow wartime atrocities to occur so history can continue. That transforms the crew from explorers into guardians of causality. They aren't choosing between good and evil. They're choosing between immediate compassion and the survival of an entire future civilization. But that also changes how we should look at Starfleet's secrecy. Perhaps Starfleet doesn't classify these missions because it enjoys keeping secrets. Perhaps it does so because some truths become dangerous simply by existing. The article also raises its only major criticism, and it's a fascinating one. If an advanced Martian civilization really existed, why has nobody ever found physical evidence? Humanity has discovered fossils from roughly the same period on Earth. Why does Mars appear completely empty? The review admits it doesn't have an answer. Interestingly, that unanswered question may become the biggest clue of all. What if the absence of evidence isn't accidental? What if the Martian civilization disappeared so completely because something actively removed it? The article doesn't claim that happened. It simply points out the mystery. But that mystery opens an entirely new direction for future stories. A civilization advanced enough to become part of such a pivotal historical event should leave traces. If there are no traces, perhaps the disappearance itself deserves just as much attention as the civilization. That possibility changes the emotional weight of the episode. Instead of asking whether Martians once existed, the question becomes who benefits from their disappearance. Was time itself responsible? Did natural history erase them? Or did someone, somewhere, decide that their story should never survive? The article never answers those questions, and perhaps that's exactly why the episode works so well. Rather than closing every mystery, it creates new ones without breaking decades of continuity. In many ways, that's what great Star Trek has always done. It doesn't simply introduce strange new worlds. It asks viewers to rethink familiar ones. The biggest surprise of Valles Marineris isn't that Mars once had intelligent life. It's that a single hidden chapter of history forces us to reconsider how much of Star Trek's past has been deliberately forgotten. If one civilization can vanish from history without anyone remembering it, what other discoveries have quietly disappeared into classified files? How many missions ended with the same decision, to protect the future by hiding the past? The article argues that this retcon succeeds because it is tucked safely into a distant corner of the timeline, avoiding the continuity problems that often follow major changes. That may be true, but the deeper consequence isn't about continuity at all, it's about trust. Can a civilization truly call itself dedicated to exploration if it chooses to erase discoveries from history? Or is Starfleet carrying a burden that ordinary citizens can never understand? A responsibility to protect a future built on fragile events that must never be disturbed? Those questions are far more interesting than whether Martians once existed. They transform the episode from a clever piece of lore into a philosophical challenge that sits at the heart of Star Trek itself. And perhaps that's the biggest revelation of all. The Martians were never the greatest secret. The greatest secret was that history itself can be rewritten, not by changing the past, but by deciding which parts of it everyone else is allowed to remember. What makes this theory even more compelling is that the article quietly points out something most viewers may not immediately appreciate. By setting the Martian civilization 65 million years in the past, the writers didn't simply introduce a new species. They insulated that revelation from almost every era of Star Trek that follows. On paper, it looks like the biggest retcon in decades. In practice, it behaves almost like a hidden chapter that was always there, waiting to be uncovered. That's an incredibly elegant way to expand the universe without forcing every future captain, admiral, or scientist to constantly reference ancient Martians. Instead, the knowledge survives only among the few people who experienced it firsthand, and according to the article, Starfleet appears determined to keep it that way. That decision may reveal something much larger about Starfleet itself. Throughout Star Trek, Starfleet has presented itself as an organization built on exploration, scientific discovery, and the pursuit of knowledge. But stories like this introduce an uncomfortable contradiction. What happens when discovering the truth becomes more dangerous than hiding it? The article repeatedly frames the Martian revelation alongside other classified events, suggesting that secrecy isn't an exception inside Starfleet. It's a recurring response whenever history becomes too fragile to expose. Suddenly, exploration and secrecy aren't opposites. They're two responsibilities constantly pulling against each other. That raises another fascinating question. If Starfleet has hidden discoveries before, how many other moments in galactic history have quietly disappeared into classified archives? The review doesn't claim there are countless examples, but it invites that line of thinking by comparing the Martian cover-up to previous classified events. Instead of treating Valles Marineris as an isolated incident, the episode can be viewed as another reminder that history isn't always erased by enemies. Sometimes it's protected by the very people sworn to preserve it. The causality paradox described in the article also deserves a closer look because it fundamentally changes how we think about destiny in Star Trek. The Enterprise doesn't simply witness history. According to the review, the crew becomes part of the sequence that ultimately allows humanity to exist. That's an extraordinary idea, because it removes the comfortable distance usually found in time travel stories. The crew isn't protecting strangers from another era. They're preserving the conditions that eventually produce every civilization, friendship, discovery, and sacrifice humanity will ever experience. When viewed through that lens, the episode stops being a story about Martians alone. It becomes a story about responsibility. Every decision the crew makes carries unimaginable consequences. The article emphasizes that they are forced to allow horrific events to unfold because preventing them would unravel the future itself. That isn't heroism in the traditional sense. It's a painful acceptance that sometimes protecting billions of future lives demands witnessing tragedies that cannot be stopped. Perhaps that's why the episode feels so different from previous Star Trek adventures. Instead of celebrating victory, it celebrates restraint. The greatest success isn't defeating an enemy or discovering a new civilization. It's preserving a timeline so fragile that even compassion becomes a dangerous temptation. The article also leaves us with its biggest unresolved mystery. If intelligent Martians truly existed, why has humanity never discovered convincing evidence of them? Fossils from Earth's distant past have survived for millions of years. Why would Mars preserve nothing comparable? The review openly admits it doesn't provide an answer, and that's precisely where the most exciting theories begin. One possibility is that the disappearance wasn't simply the result of time. Another is that the Martian civilization was erased so completely by the events surrounding its destruction that little recognizable remained. The article doesn't support either explanation directly, but it clearly identifies the absence of evidence as the one lingering question hanging over an otherwise convincing retcon. That unanswered question could become fertile ground for future Star Trek stories without contradicting anything the review presents. And that's ultimately why this twist works so well. The article argues that the writers didn't rewrite Star Trek's history carelessly. They expanded it by adding a forgotten chapter hidden at the very beginning of the timeline, then built a believable reason why no one speaks about it centuries later. Rather than weakening established canon, the episode challenges viewers to reconsider how much of history may still be waiting in the shadows, not because it never happened, but because someone decided it should remain forgotten. If that's the lesson of Valles Marineris, then the Martians aren't merely Star Trek's newest ancient civilization, they represent a larger truth about the franchise itself. Exploration isn't only about discovering what's out there. Sometimes it's about confronting the uncomfortable realization that the greatest mysteries were hidden from us all along. And if one forgotten civilization can remain buried for 60 million years, who can honestly say the Federation has uncovered every secret history the galaxy still holds?